Hello YouTube. Today we're going to be looking at the conifers or evergreen order of trees. And these are also known as gymnosperms because they have cones as their fruit and needles instead of leaves, or their leaves are needles. So this is the order Pinales, and in our area we're going to be looking at three different families. There's the Pinaceae, which are pines, spruce, eastern hemlock, and firs. There's the Capressaceae family, which are also known as the cypress family, which consists of the eastern white cedar and junipers. And then the Taxaceae family, which are yews. We're not going to go through every species just because it might take too long, but we are going to look at distinguishing characteristics between the different families, as well as distinguishing characteristics between different genera within families. So one major characteristics are the different ways the needles attach to branches. If we look here on the left, these are both pines, and with pines the needles are always grouped to a single point. So this is a Scotch pine here. There are two paired needles attached to a single point. Most pines are like this with two paired needles. However, the white pine has 5 paired needles attached to a single point. The only other species that has multiple needles attached to a single point is up here on the right, and this is the tamarack, and it can have up to 20 needles attached to a single spur branch, which is then attached to the main branch. The rest of the groups have their needles attached individually to the branch. So up here we have a white spruce. Down on the bottom on the left we have an eastern hemlock, and on the right we have a balsam fir. So the difference between these three groups is that the spruce have very rigid and pointy needles, and if you dissect them across, you'll see they're more of a square shaped, whereas the eastern hemlock and the balsam fir, or firs in general, their needles are flat and they're more rounded at the edge. And also with the eastern hemlock and the firs, there are white lines on the undersides of the leaf. To tell the difference between those two groups, the eastern hemlock, their needles narrow to a smaller point when they attach to the branch, whereas the firs, you can see, are much thicker at their attachment place. I don't have a picture here of yew needles, but they're similar to the hemlock and the firs in that they're flattened, however they're more pointed, and they don't have white lines on the bottom. Another good distinguishing characteristic between different groups are the shape and size of the pine cones. So these are all pine species here, but this still applies to different spruce species and different cedar species as well. Depending on your field guide, they can distinguish different species based on the length of the cone, the shape, as well as the shape of the scales. So each little piece is known as a scale. Sometimes they can be more rounded, sometimes they can be more pointed, depending on the species. So the first family are the pines, which include the balsam fir, a number of different spruce, the tamarack, the eastern hemlock, and a number of different pines. These are all the genera names here on the side, in case you want to know the scientific names. One thing to note, the tamarack is the only evergreen species that does change color in the fall and loses its needles, so technically it's not an evergreen, but it's still a gymnosperm. The next family is the cypress family. So this includes the eastern white cedar, which is Thuya occidentalis, as well as the junipers. So this includes a couple of different juniper species as well as the eastern red cedar. So the eastern red cedar actually has more in common with junipers than it does the eastern white cedar, despite having a similar common name. But the way to tell the eastern white cedar apart from the junipers is that the eastern white cedar has these scale-like needles on the left here, whereas the junipers have a mix of scale-like and more pointed. So this is an eastern red cedar here, and you'll see the scale-like on the left as well as the pointed on the right. So one tree will have a combination of both these types of leaves. And then with the other juniper species, they're more shrub-like as opposed to tree-like, where we see here an eastern red cedar is characteristically tree-shaped, whereas junipers will be more shrub-shaped, and they only have leaves consisting of these more pointed needles, or awl-shaped leaves, as they say here. And then if we look at the yew family, it's also shrub-like, and again it has the flattened needles that are pointed that don't have white lines on the underside. They also have these characteristic red fruits, but again, depending on what time of year you find the plant, they might not be on it, so we can't rely just on the presence of the red fruits. So I'm going to show a picture of a couple of juniper species from the University of Wisconsin website. So we have these two species, the common and creeping juniper, and you can see here from the pictures, again, they're more shrub-like as opposed to tree-like, with just these pointed needles as opposed to scale-like and pointed that the eastern red cedar has. And looking at the creeping juniper gets its name from the way it grows horizontally across the ground as opposed to growing vertically, hence the scientific name Juniperus horizontalis. So yeah, I think that's it for the conifers. So we'll just quickly review. Pine needles will always be paired, or in the case of white pine, have 5 needles attached to a single point attaching to the branch. Tamarack will have up to 20 needles attaching to a spur branch attaching to the branch. And then everything else in the pine family and yews will have needles attached individually to the branch. Spruce have rigid, pointy needles that are like a square if dissected, whereas eastern hemlock and firs have flat needles that are more rounded and have white underneath, whereas the yew needles are flat but are more pointed without white. The hemlock have a more narrow base, whereas the firs have a thick base. The eastern white cedar just has scale-like needles, whereas junipers and eastern red cedar have a mix of scale-like and needle-like.